My name is Ryan Paul, and I teach history here at SUU, and I'm the director of Eccles A.P.E.X. And on behalf of myself and the Eccles A.P.E.X. team, Sophie Javage, Faith Christensen, and Kason Graff, I want to welcome you to social safety and human thriving across the spectrum of sexual and gender diversity. I would also like to thank the Eccles Foundation for their generous and continuous support of this program, Dr. Brian Koenig of the Psychology Department, the SUU Women's Network, University of Utah graduate students Jay Christensen and Julia Decker, Dr. Crystal Koenig of the History, Sociology, and Anthropology Department, and last but not least, the Provost's Office for making this event possible. I would like to remind you that today's conversation will continue this afternoon at 3 p.m. on Thunder 91.1 and on the Eccles A.P.E.X. Radio Hour podcast. Dr. Lisa Diamond is a professor of psychology and gender studies at the University of Utah. She studies the expression of sexual attraction and sexual identity over the life course and the influences of early life experiences on later sexual development. Dr. Diamond is best known for her research on sexual fluidity, which describes the capacity for individuals to experience shifts in their pattern of same-sex and other sex attractions over time. Her 2008 book, Sexual Fluidity, published by Harvard University Press, describes the changes and transformations that she has observed in the sexual attractions, behaviors, and identities of a sample of lesbian, bisexual, and unlabeled women that she has been following since 1995. Her book has been awarded the Distinguished Book Award from the American Psychological Association's Society for the Study of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgendered Issues. Dr. Diamond is co-editor of the APA Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology and is a fellow of 2 divisions of the APA. Dr. Diamond has published over 120 articles and book chapters and has been invited to present her research at over 100 national and international universities and conferences. She has received awards for her work from the APA, the American Association of University Women, the International Association for Relationship Research, the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality, and the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. While there will be no formal question and answer period, Dr. Diamond has graciously agreed to answer any questions after her presentation is over, so please come on up to the front after she has concluded. It is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Lisa Diamond to Southern Utah University and to the Eccles A.P.E.X. stage.
All right, so I'm just delighted to be here and such a great turnout, and I just want to give like a little heart love to anyone in the broader LGBTQ family and those who love them. I always feel like this is a moment to sort of connect across the state, and this is I want to start with some acknowledgements, but now my clicker does not recognize my existence. Oh my God, does it now? I see a blue dot. I really want to thank Ryan Paul for making this possible. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I want to give a shout out to my graduate students, Jay and Julia, and to, it really takes a village to do this sort of work. And so I really want to give a shout out of appreciation to all the folks who've been collaborators with me. Now, this is an interesting sort of historical moment to be doing a talk like this, right? Because we've just had a piece of legislation passed that is directly relevant to these questions of diversity. And, I actually tried to read the bill the other day, and this is the format in which these things are written. It's very overwhelming to try to get your head around exactly what is kind of happening and what this means. There's a lot of discussion of identity and characteristics and, blah, 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 blah. And, there's this emphasis on identity. And we often think about diversity in terms of, identity characteristics. And that's certainly how this particular bill, was written. But one of the things I hope to sort of bring our awareness to is that identity is too limited a term for really what we're talking about. That when we're talking about diversity, we're really talking about lived experiences and kind of lived history. And sometimes that's represented in some sort of identity label, but really it's about, differences in lived experience. And one of the things that I think is really relevant, and one of the things that I find really kind of unique and interesting, is that, our lived experience here in Utah is also a distinct kind of identity and community and experience. And so often when we have these debates about diversity, we're thinking at like the broader national level, but these things are very local and these things are very kind of unique and individual. And so everything that I'm going to talk about is relevant to individuals' personal lived experiences in their own social community. And so I think it's helpful to try to kind of set aside the broader national debates about identities and groups, and to kind of think about these things in a very kind of local context. But I'm going to start by kind of zooming us out to show you a little bit about what we know about stigma-related health disparities. Because frankly, one of the reasons, right, the piece of legislation that passed and similar pieces of legislation that are passing around the country are targeting kind of programs that are trying to address in some way the legacy of historical marginalization and exclusion on certain groups. And one of the reasons that those programs exist, and that this is even something that we talk about, is that we've known for 20 plus years that individuals who are socially marginalized for one reason or another, race, ethnicity, social class, sexual identity, gender identity, you name it, that they tend to have health disparities. In other words, their physical and mental health, and often their educational outcomes, are different. And that there's it's a secret clicker, It's like in the airplanes when they refuel in flight.
Nothing. It's really not one of those.
Still doesn't work. Oh my God. Okay, so this is some data. And so I wanted to give you a sense of what those health disparities look like, because I think it's helpful to understand that, especially in the context of why we even have, things that are trying to address the effects of marginalization, because the health effects of marginalization are pretty big. These are data from the National Epidemiological Study of Alcohol and Related Conditions. So this is a national sample of U.S. adults that's done every couple of years. So it's around 40,000 individuals, and this is a random representative sample, so it's good quality data. And I will just say that the disparities I'm going to show you, you also find similar disparities for race and ethnicity. So most of this talk I'm going to be focusing about sexuality and gender, but everything that I'm talking about also applies to other forms of marginalization, and the patterns are pretty similar. It's also important to note that none of these forms of marginalization exist in isolation of one another. Human experience is intersectional. No one is a white woman or a white man. You are your race and ethnicity and your social class and all those things together. So none of these are easily separated, but we kind of zoom in on one at a time to try and get a sense of what things are going on. So if you look at some of the major mental health conditions that have been looked at, major depression, generalized anxiety disorder, PTSD, which is a kind of cluster of symptoms that usually include things like startle response and difficulty sleeping and kind of traumatic stress responses, and suicidality. These are the rates for heterosexually identified women, and these are the rates for all of the women who aren't heterosexual. And you'll see they're significantly elevated. You find the same exact pattern with men. Those are the heterosexually identified men. That's everybody else. You find similar disparities in health risk behavior. These are the disparities for women. These are the disparities for men. And historically, as these data, started to be more reliably collected over the past 20 years, the conventional explanation, both with regard to sexual and gender identity and also with regard to other, for race and ethnicity and anything involving some sort of stigmatized status, has been something called minority stress. And the basic idea is, what's different about the life of a marginalized person? And what's different is stigma-related stressors, that one of the features of being a marginalized or stigmatized individual is, kind of poor treatment by the social group, which we typically measure by asking individuals how frequently they've experienced things like being discriminated against, being harassed or called names or victimized, being spoken of poorly. And so there's a lot of different measures that attempt to capture how the day-to-day fabric of your life, your lived experience as a stigmatized person is different because of that stigma. And the way psychologists have generally operationalized that is, exposure to these sorts of events. And health psychology, the sort of field of research that looks at the effects of our, day-to-day experiences on our health, has talked about a phenomenon called allostatic load. In other words, the notion that each and every experience of stress takes a toll on us. And we have a sort of intuitive sense of this. We talk colloquially all the time. I'm so stressed out. I can't handle it. Stress overload, toxic stress. We say things like that all the time. And we have this intuitive sense that too much stress is bad for us. And the physiological explanation is almost like a car breaking down, like wear and tear on the stress response system. And it makes a lot of intuitive sense. It's not actually all that, accurate. But one way to sort of understand it in a sort of common sense way is the idea is that every time you experience a stressor, your body adjusts, it revs up, like your heart rate might go up, and then it has to sort of calm itself back down again. And that process of revving up and then coming back down is an adaptation, and that adaptation is costly. It requires energy. It requires, something going on in your brain and body. So the idea is you're going on in your life, and then the stressor happens, and you adjust to the stressor, and then you calm down afterward. And according to this view, the thing that is different about the life of a marginalized individual is they've got more to cope with. They've got more things in their everyday life that they have to adapt to. And so when we give out those questionnaires that are like how often you've been discriminated against, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we're basically trying to operationalize what have you been exposed to? How much adaptation is your brain and body going through on an everyday level that's pulling you off of your calm, natural baseline? And so that the experience of marginalization is an experience of being pulled off your calm baseline by stressors. And over the course of your lifespan, that will take a toll on your mental and physical health. So there were some things about this model that we certainly got right. We actually know quite a lot about the psychobiology of the stress response. We know how it affects your cardiovascular functioning and your neuroendocrine functioning. We know how long it takes to react to a stressor. We know how long it takes to recover from a stressor. There's been tons of experimental studies that have looked at that. And we also know that different stressors are different, that people appraise them differently, that a stressor that happens at home is different from a stressor at work. So we've done a great job with all of those different features of the stress response. But one thing that we never really focused on was the baseline. All of these theories and all of these models are sort of based in our modern kind of in post-industrial life in which we have a lot of control over the stress in our life. So we sort of assume, oh yes, the baseline is nice and calm. And then we go out into the world and we face, a stressor. And we had not really thought about whether the assumption of a calm baseline is actually accurate. And I read this groundbreaking paper that was written by Jos Brost and some colleagues called The Generalized Unsafety Theory of Stress. And it completely kind of turned my brain inside out. And it had a big effect on a lot of other colleagues too. I think it's like a mini revolution happening in health psychology. And they really focused on this question of our assumption of a calm baseline. And what they pointed out is that if you really look at what we now know about the neurobiology of the stress response, it's not an activational system. It's an inhibitory system. In other words, we don't start out calm and then wait for a stressor to activate us. We start out activated, and when no stress is around, we inhibit that response, and then we calm down. And the whole reason that this is important is that in the ancestral condition, we had a lot of danger. We were in a generally unsafe environment. It's nothing like now when you can assume that you'll have food and you'll have clothes and you'll have shelter. Of course, we assume a calm baseline. That's our kind of modern, perspective. But if you really look at how the brain evolved and the evolution of the nervous system, it evolved during a period where unsafety was the baseline, where danger was everywhere. And under those conditions, starting out calm makes no sense. And as Jos Brost talks about in this article, from the perspective of the evolved human brain, better to flee 10 times too often than once too few. And so we were never calm waiting for stress. We were always, completely stressed out all the time. And that's really just because of the ancestral context that was replete, with danger. And according to their perspective, the most adaptive state for a human, in the ancestral condition was constant wariness and vigilance. You do not know where the next threat is coming. You do not know where your resources are coming from. Every day is a little bit unpredictable. And if that is true, then you need to be on all the time. And so that really changes the way that we should think about what is different about the experiences of marginalized individuals versus other individuals. So like this representation of the life of a marginalized individual going through lots of stressors, this is just not what is true for humans at all. Like this is not an accurate picture of the situation. It's more like that. We just start out high. We start out high and we're waiting for cues to make us feel safe. So it almost, you could have a lot of stressors or you could have very few, but your vigilant brain is watching nonetheless. And what's kind of interesting is that if you look at the sort of history of health psychological research on health disparities in marginalized groups, we focused all of the attention on the stressors. What's different about your life? What's happening to you? What did that person say? How did your body respond? How often did it happen? When did it happen? We have focused all of our attention on those discrete stress events, and we've sort of ignored the thousands of minutes and hours and days that transpire between those events, as if we're sort of reducing the experience of marginalization to the events of those stressors and not the quality of your life between those stressors. And what we now know is that those are pretty important periods, that it's that vigilance that is a part of our evolved human nervous system that when it's too high is associated with a lot of downstream consequences for physical and mental functioning, and that is a process that we have basically been missing for, the past 20 years. The hopeful thing about this is that it turns out that the solution to a lot of this does not necessarily require that we completely change all the laws and policies. Often if you read the minority stress perspective, it's like, wow, we won't get healthier until we eliminate all discrimination everywhere. Yeah, that's going to happen, any day now. The solution from a sort of evolutionary perspective is much more simple. That if you look at how humans evolved, the thing that brings the vigilance down, that communicates that you're not going to die, that your stress response system doesn't have to be overactivated, is quite simply other people. Literally, the physical presence of other people that include you and protect you. And this is what psychoneuroimmunologist George Slavich calls social safety, which he defines as unconditional social connection, inclusion, belonging, and protection. And he argues that if you look at humans as a species, we are so deeply social that the simple presence of warm others around us is a cue to our nervous system, you're going to be okay. It cannot be that bad if there is at least one other person that's with you. And these are, it's like belonging is a phrase. It's driving me crazy how everything is about belonging. It's like, my friend works at Google, and I was visiting her at Google, and they're like, Google, belonging. I'm like, oh God, no, not even Google, right? Belonging has now been this buzzword, and it kind of bothers me because it sounds kind of touchy-feely. It's like belonging. But from an evolutionary perspective, this is like food and water. This is literally necessary to a human brain because humans evolved in small groups where being pushed out of the group was a literal death sentence. So our modern notion of belonging is not what I'm talking about. It's a deeper sense of you are okay because you are a part of something. You are, being kind of included in a larger group. And I also think it's relevant to understanding how we talk about social rejection. When we will often describe individuals as being oversensitive to rejection, like, oh yeah, the problem with that. I'm like, oh my God, everybody's so oversensitive. For the human brain, there's no such thing as being oversensitive to rejection because we are wired to be oversensitive to rejection because rejection was a death sentence in the ancestral condition. That's what our brains evolved for. And I think anyone that if you just think in your mind of a time that you felt ashamed or embarrassed in front of other people, and if you remember that and you remember how it felt in your body, you probably felt really hot and you probably kind of felt it all over. That is not an accident. It is not an accident that shame and embarrassment affect us in a way that other negative emotions do not affect us. Because in the ancestral condition, that was a sign that you did something that might get you pushed out of the group. And your nervous system is like, do not ever do that again. And do not miss what's happening. A primary function of emotions is to get our attention. Shame gets our attention like nothing else. That's a legacy of humans as a social species. And so when we dismiss the concerns of individuals who say, I was not included, I did not feel seen in that room or in that environment, we have to understand that our bodies respond to that viscerally and powerfully as a fundamental life threat. And I think in our modern context, we don't really appreciate that. We don't really get that. And also, our need for social contact as a species is why, every human society has all these different rituals and things that we do to connect individuals to one another. Different social groups have greeting rituals and goodbye rituals, and we know how to communicate that things are okay. Sharing a meal, making jokes, touching, right? We have all these ways to communicate in social groups. You're okay for now. Yeah, we're going to sit down together. The rules that we have about proximity, how close or how far, our brains and our bodies expect that our proximity to other people and their inclusion of us is so important that we notice that, we attend to it, we notice facial expressions. We will notice an expression of disgust. Your nervous system will register that before your prefrontal cortex does. We are wired to pay attention to whether the other people around us kind of include us and think we're okay, or don't include us and don't think we're okay. And this is what we haven't really been focusing on in the experience of marginalization. That even if you have never been explicitly discriminated against, even if you have never been harassed or followed home and you've never been called a name, walking through life with some of those cues of inclusion and connection withheld from you because other people view you as weird or different or other or gross, that is as big a threat to our health and well-being as explicit stressors. It's not to say that explicit stressors don't matter. Of course they do. But in all of our attention to that, we haven't been attending to what it means to lack the social connection that is literally the lifeblood of the human nervous system and is necessary, for our functioning. So that even when stress exposure is low, the lack of cues of social connection, reminders of inclusion, is just as threatening to our health. We all need consistent, reliable, unconditional protection and connection from the people around us. It's literally what we need for our brains to function properly. There's a quote from a friend and colleague of mine, Jim Cohn, who talks about this in the context of social baseline theory, that really the human brain evolved to expect a baseline of social connection. The dominant ecology to which humans are adapted is not any one terrain, diet, or climate, but each other. Social relatedness and its psychological correlates constitute the normal baseline ecology of the functional human brain. And this is why loneliness is as big of a threat to your health over your lifespan as smoking. This is why when you take prisoners and you put them in solitary confinement, they typically go mad. Our brains are not meant to be alone. We need not just other people with us, but other people looking us in the eye and affirming us and saying, oh, I got you, I got you, I got you. Because humans could not survive without that in the ancestral world. Now, one thing people often ask me is, well, I don't understand why this is such a big problem now, because it's so much more accepting. Like, I read that 1 out of 5 Gen Zers, identify as LGBTQ, and now you've got marriage, and now, there's all these things, and it's such a more accepting environment than it was 50 years ago. That is absolutely true. Unfortunately, it turns out that a bigger influence on vigilance than kind of consistent rejection is uncertainty. What has happened now that we have a lot more acceptance in a lot of different areas of society is that now marginalized individuals face a very inconsistent social environment. Total inclusion over here, and then you'll be over here and it's like, is it as good over here or is it not? And from place to place, workplace to workplace, city to city, you find an inconsistent environment where you're not sure if the people around you really include you or whether they're saying the thing that they're supposed to say because now everybody has inclusion policies and no one's going to say something bad to your face, right? So we have a very uncertain social environment, and we know from guts theory and from other work that uncertainty is a primary trigger for the human brain. And if you have any doubt about the way that uncertainty can hijack your cognition, just kind of think about that. Just think about how it makes you feel. Just think about the degree to which when you're watching those dots vibrating, your brain doesn't want to do anything else. You're not going to be thinking about school. You're not going to be doing your taxes or anything else. Our brains focus on uncertainty, again, because of evolution. One of the major threats to humans in the ancestral condition was uncertainty, was unpredictability. Where's the food? Where's the threat? Where's the danger? Where's the shelter? Uncertainty is a problem that the human brain always tries to solve. And now we have a hugely uncertain social climate. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. And the metaphor I like to use is like, being gay now is like being at a party and someone hands you a glass of water and they're like, oh, here's a glass of ice water. There's just a tiny piece of glass in there somewhere. Good luck. Maybe you won't hit it. So the vigilance, our stress exposure may have gone down. I've never been harassed in my life, but our vigilance has not changed because the uncertainty of rejection, remains. And so I think one way to sort of think about what it is that makes the lives of marginalized people different, historically we've said, oh, they have greater exposure to stress. I think you could equally say that a primary feature of marginalization is chronic uncertainty about your social inclusion and your social safety. Moving through the world, never being able to take that for granted, never being able to stop kind of looking and checking and being sure what's going on in this group, what's going on in that group. And unfortunately, a lot of marginalized individuals adapt with a whole bunch of sort of behaviors and cognitions that work really well in the moment, but they are taxing. They are taxing biologically and they are taxing physically to just constantly be checking, monitoring. What can I do? Maybe I'll do, oh, be nice to this person. Oh, I'm going to say this. I'm going to do this. How can I make sure? How can I make my inclusion more certain? And that can promote a lot of maladaptive behaviors that don't seem maladaptive at the time, but over the course of a lifespan, take a toll on your mind, and your body. So around this time when I give this talk, people are like, okay, well, what does that mean? What's the difference between a safe and an unsafe environment? So here are just some examples of, things that I think are not the kinds of things that we capture in a lot of research, but they're part of the fabric of social safety. So I'll just put, a bunch of them up there, and I'll just let you quietly kind of look through this list and think about how these make people feel. And what are analogs in your own life for times that you have felt that somebody was looking out for you or seeing you as a unique individual? So some of the things I want to point out to you is that I specifically added little elements that I think are relevant. So people lending you clothes for a date. That doesn't really count as social support. Who needs extra clothes? The point there is shared pleasure. I think everyone's had the experience of maybe going shopping for something with a friend and they're like, oh, that looks great on you, you should get it. And the idea that somebody else is taking pleasure in your pleasure and in your happiness, that is a cue of safety, sort of shared kind of joy. So it's not always just about protection from danger. It's about other people sharing your positive experiences as well as negative experiences, which is why I think it's so important that when we create kind of support services for marginalized populations, it shouldn't just be about talking about your problems. We need gay proms, right? We need celebrations. We need, what is Pride Month? But some experience of shared joy. You don't reach a state of joyful exuberance when you're vigilant. You just don't. So one of the things that happens when we're laughing and when we're feeling joyful, our brains won't even get there until we feel some degree of safety. And I think it's why in so many movies, if they're trying to resolve some tension or show that something's going to be okay, they'll inject humor, right? Humor is a sign it must be okay. It must be a little bit okay if we're laughing. So we have to include joy and pleasure and exuberance as a part of what we want in a life that feels safe to marginalized groups. I think this issue of proximity, people making room for one another. We've known for years that one of the subtle manifestations of racism that a lot of people experience is people crossing the street or moving physically away. I have a colleague, Janine Stefanucci at the University of Utah, and she and Sarah Creamer-Guerra, another of my colleagues, focus on how humans automatically become sensitive to proximity to other social creatures. And when we find someone disgusting, we want to move away from them. And when when we like someone, we want to draw closer. Proximity to others is sort of wired into us. And so if you are a marginalized person and you're moving through your life, noticing that people are not wanting to sit next to you, they're moving slightly away from you. Again, are those stressors? They might not show up on a list of stressors, but our brains are looking for those sorts of indicators. Am I included or am I not? I also like this one because I'm now obsessed with taking pictures of strangers, just trying to make them feel safer all the time. Like I see strangers taking a selfie and I'm like, can I take your picture? And it's like, I just want to offer a little safety to everyone. I'm like, you get some, you get some. And my wife tells me that I'm like a social safety slut now. I offer it to everybody, like indiscriminately. But it always makes people smile and it's like, try it, you'll love it. And here are some examples of a lack of safety, right? These are things that, are they necessarily stressors? I don't know, but they definitely communicate that something about you is different or may not be included. So again, I'll just let you peruse these. And I specifically included this one for all my fellow academics. Yes, isn't it great that we have diversity committees and diversity groups? And of course, those of us who occupy marginalized categories are asked to be on those groups, which is great. Like, I love being on those groups. But every time it's like, oh yeah, I guess that is how I am coded. You know, I'm the diversity person. And it's this weird thing we operate like, yes, I want those programs to exist, but every time we try to address marginalization in institutions, we come back and forth with this thing that the very process of addressing the issue reminds individuals of their status, you know, in an institution. Same thing with, you know, research as me search. Those of us who study things that relate to us personally also have this thing of like, oh, is everyone just assuming that I'm interested in this because it affects me, right? So there are these subtle forms of judgment and am I really included that often arise in ways that are not, you know, stressors. One way to think of it is like, none of this is all that bad, right? All of these often happen in the context of immense privilege, right? So to be marginalized, to feel marginalized because I'm on the diversity committee at my department, it's like, well, I have incredible skin privilege, I have incredible class privilege. These things are not that bad. I'm not talking about comparing these to victimization. I'm trying to point our attention to the way our brains process different events. And that if we really think about the fact that our social brain evolved in an ancestral context where uncertainty and social inclusion were paramount, then we realize that by simply focusing on like violence and not focusing on these more subtle indicators of inclusion, we're kind of missing a key part of how our brains actually process kind of social categories. One, you know, as I mentioned, none of these sort of count as victimization, but they make you sort of unsure. And one of the things that then happens is, you know, similar to what I mentioned before, people will then do things to try to address that experience. And I think that this is one of the things that really affects marginalized students, whether they are high school students, whether they are college students, whether they are graduate students, whether they are postdocs. If you are in a lower power position and you are not certain of your inclusion, you're probably going to really do a lot of things to make sure to make your inclusion more certain. You're going to overwork. You're going to overperform. You're going to, you know, be kind of constantly monitoring, you know, your environment. And all of those things will work really well. You know, they worked for me my whole career, but they take a toll as well. And we see that over and over. I think there's a lot of scholarship now on sort of what happens to marginalized individuals in business, in medicine, and all these places where we have made inroads in actually having more diverse populations, but often those populations never feel that they can actually stop monitoring their acceptability in that space. And that if we create an environment where, we have all these individuals from diverse perspectives, and all of them are walking around like live wires because they cannot mess up. They have no room for error. They had better be, exactly what everybody wants them to be. That's not actual inclusion. And yet this is a harder thing to fix, right? This is a much, much harder thing to fix than like a workplace policy about, and again, are these that bad? I don't know. There is no metric for these things. But it calls our attention, again, to the way our evolved brains are operating in response to social marginalization. One of the problems that, we face in doing this work is that, we're all kind of agreeing that, safety is important. Well, how do we measure it? And how do you capture it? How do you improve it? How do you identify where you have it and where you don't? And this is something that, we have really been struggling to do, because most of the measures that are out there are measures of stress. They're not measures of positive experiences. So we've created a measure that we have piloted here in Utah and in a number of other states that we're trying to sort of turn people's attention to the role of safety in everyday life. And what we basically do is we ask people to answer these questions, not in general, but with regard to specific settings. What's going on in your household? What's going on in your family? What's going on with your close friendships? What's going on at work or at school? What happens in public spaces, in airports, in public restrooms? What's happening in your local faith community or in your identity community? And so we ask people to think about those different domains, and we ask them things like, how often are the people in this setting happy to see you? How often do they make you laugh or smile? How positive do they treat you? How often do they make you feel that you matter? How often are you so comfortable with them that you lose track of time? Because you don't lose track of time when you're afraid and when you're vigilant. That flow state, which is what we often want students to experience, we're like, study for the exam and you'll be so into it. You can't create that wonderful, juicy brain state of creativity if you are checking, monitoring, your performance. So these are really related to what we need to thrive intellectually as well as, physically and mentally. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying that stress doesn't matter. I just think that we need to really look at them as orthogonal dimensions, right? So if you have a lot of social connection and safety, and you're lucky enough to not have that much stress, that's kind of one way to think about what it means to experience privilege. That privilege is the ability to kind of, know that you have plentiful access to social resources, regardless of whether or not you're going to need them. Resilience is often described as, an individual trait that some people have that makes it possible for them to survive in the face of stress. More recently, a lot of scholars have said resilience is really a social phenomenon. The kids that are resilient are often, in the face of extreme stress, are often kids that have strong social networks and often family networks. And so resilience, you could define as the state of having high access to social safety so that when the stressors come, that load is shared. It's shared with the group and you're not alone. The state of having low social safety and low stress is that state of hypervigilance, right? That you can't assume that you're going to be okay, but nothing that bad has happened to you. You're just in that constant state of preparation, right? So that's sort of the unmeasured dimension that we're trying to call attention to. And then if you have low social safety and a lot of stress, that is what sort of trips you over into the realm of a full-blown, trauma response, where, and trauma is often defined as a situation where the demands of the stressor exceed your ability to cope. and that it is a primal threat that is beyond what you can manage. And so one of the things that's sort of tricky is like, well, where's the line between stress and trauma? And where's the line between low safety and high safety? That we really don't know, right? Like, I make it look really easy. Oh, too low, high. What's enough? Nobody really knows. And I also think that there's lots of individual differences. Some individuals, especially individuals who've grown up with a lot of early life adversity or who've grown up with a lot of maltreatment and did not grow up internalizing a sense of safety, are going to need more acceptance and inclusion from their social environment to keep them, functional. And that's something that we really need to focus on, is that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. Everybody has a different threshold for what is going to make them feel included. And I think anyone who's ever tried to develop classroom policies or like, this is inclusive and this is how we make everybody feel affirmed, there is no thing that's universally going to make everybody feel affirmed. Give up looking. It's not there. We're actually going to have to do the work of finding out what is necessary for the people, that are in our immediate environment. So I mentioned trauma, and so I want to bring in trauma, and I have to give a shout out to Jay. Like, I wasn't even thinking about trauma before I started working with Jay, and he's like, I think some of this sounds like trauma. And I was like, oh yeah, trauma. And we started delving into the research on trauma and found that it was hugely related, partly because, again, trauma is defined as a response to a primal threat. Well, we used to think that a primal threat meant you were beaten, you were assaulted, you were raped, you were in war, right? The whole literature on PTSD kind of came out of looking at the symptomology of individuals who had been in the military and individuals who had shell shock and suffered from post-traumatic responses to combat. So primal threat was defined as physical threat, a threat to your physical body, in the same way that we used to define stress as like, discrimination or something that's like happening, to you. And though in the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, those physical threats are considered criteria A events. And when you're diagnosed, the psychologist will be like, and what was the thing that happened that you can't stop having nightmares about? Oh, it was a bombing. Oh, it was my friend dying. Oh, it was this. And so you get a diagnosis of PTSD if you had a criteria A event, and if you show some of these psychobiological adaptations that people develop when their brains are adapting to threat, which have a whole bunch of different manifestations. And I also have to give a shout out to Julia, who made me aware of the role of obsessive compulsive behavior as a trauma response, and that there's all these complex things that come up. And the problem is that over the years, people discovered that, wow, there's a lot of folks who have all of this stuff going on, and yet they don't have a criteria A event. They didn't have a bombing, they weren't raped, and yet their lives are being changed by all of these things. And I'll say, one of the things that made me aware of this is that it's happening in the military all the time now, because there's a lot of folks who are not experiencing primal threat in the military, right? Drone attacks, no physical threat. I can bomb the target without even being at risk, but they're being exposed to constant vigilance and constant unsafety. And maybe they do a whole tour of duty and nothing happens, but they come home racked with these symptoms, but they can't get insurance coverage because they didn't experience a primal threat, according to the military. And so there's been a lot of movement to try to alter our clinical definitions of PTSD to include these chronic experiences of unsafety that have the same effect on our nervous system. And so it's sometimes called CPTSD or complex PTSD. And what my colleagues in the military tell me is that it's considered like little c, like, oh, it's not real trauma, it's little trauma. We cannot help downgrading social trauma. We still consider it less important than physical trauma. It's just a complete disconnect that kind of drives me crazy. And a lot of the research on CPTSD occurred in the context of understanding the effects of childhood maltreatment and childhood sexual abuse. And one of the real kind of advances in that field is that they've found that even for individuals who maybe never experienced childhood sexual abuse, but were groomed, were being sort of, by some, like maybe it never happened, but the grooming process or the fear or living with a parent who didn't hit you but kept threatening to, that is also a trauma, that our brains need social safety so much that when it is systematically withdrawn, your brain will adapt. And we're now realizing that all of our focus on physical threat has really missed this sort of phenomenon. And that if you really then extend this, then you have an appreciation for the fact that stigma, living a life of stigma, it's kind of like living with an unpredictable alcoholic parent, right? It's a form of complex trauma where you don't know where the nurturance is, you don't know where the protection is. Sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's not, you're never really sure. And so what we have been talking about in terms of minority stress, like a stress response, is more like this sort of self-protective traumatic vigilance that comes to characterize a life of uncertainty and chronic unsafety. So, now that I've made you aware of this, I hope that you'll all go off into the world and try to make things better. And how do we do that? I will just say right now, I do not know. We are trying to find out. Obviously, we should not stop the efforts that we are engaged in to try to reduce overt discrimination and victimization. Obviously, that still needs to happen, and that's a critical kind of value. But it's not going to actually change the broad-based mental and physical health disparities for marginalized groups unless we also find a way to draw down that stigma-related vigilance, fear, shame that is a part of the fabric of everyday life for marginalized individuals. So obviously the solution to that should be increasing social safety. How do we actually do that? It's not really clear. One of the things that I think is tricky is that, because initially when I started kind of working on this, people were like, oh, I guess that's why like pride flags are so important. And I'm like, is a flag really going to cut it? If you're talking about unconditional affirmation and protection, it's certainly seeing a pride flag is better than not seeing one, but that's not enough, right? And these days, especially with the sort of the corporatization of pride, you can see pride flags all the time and they don't necessarily mean anything. It's like, oh, Smirnoff has a pride vodka bottle. Thank you, that's really helpful. And given that uncertainty is a trigger for unsafety, it's like, yeah, what does that mean? Does it mean you want to make money off of the gay community? Like, that doesn't necessarily make anyone feel better. I really think that the only kind of protection and connection that really makes a difference is kind of what we evolved for, which is face-to-face, which is actually being together. There was a period of time where I was like, maybe online support groups are the answer. They are not the answer. That's not what our brains evolved to need. Certainly being able to connect with a support group in another part of the country or another part of the world is better than not. But no, that is not going to increase someone's base level of social safety. We need to spend more time together, and we need to spend more time with individuals that validate us and give us that feeling. And often what people are like, what's one like common sense tip, that you can give? And, because I have no other good ideas, I just basically say, figure out in your life who gives you that feeling, who makes you feel like you can lose track of time and you can be yourself, and spend more time with them. Just put your brain with that person more and find a way to make sure that, because you can't be safe all the time. That's not what life is like. But we evolved as humans to go out into the dangerous world and then to come back home by the fire, and to go out into the dangerous world and come back around the campfire. We all need a personal psychological campfire of individuals who love us and want to be around us no matter what we do, whose love we do not have to earn, with good behavior, good grades, credentials, people who literally just like us just because we're us. That is what we evolved to need. And we have to look for ways in local contexts to create opportunities for individuals to have that experience. So the interventions that are going to work are not going to be big federal interventions. They're going to be small. They're going to be tiny. They're going to be communities making space for one another individually. And it doesn't have to be 24 hours a day, but it has to be somewhere. We know that gay-straight alliances in high schools serve this function. And half the time, a lot of the kids that show up, that's the alliance thing, are like a bunch of well-meaning heterosexual kids. And you know what? They benefit too, because it's defined as a space that is supposed to be affirming. Everybody needs that. You don't need to be marginalized to experience the benefits of a community that makes sure that everybody has access to unconditional affirmation and protection. Those things tell the brain, you're not on your own, you can relax, somebody else, is with you. That's the only way to reduce the vigilance and the kind of neurological inflammation that happens when we don't feel safe. So I'll leave you with this wonderful quote from Terrence Real, who is a couples therapist who wrote a beautiful book called Us, which is really about couples, but it's also about the human condition. And he says, we are individuals, yes, but individuals whose lifeblood is connection. We are individuals whose very existence is predicated on belonging, right? Real belonging. That's going to be the only way that we can really move the needle on health disparities. Thank you so much.